Hello and welcome to Liquid New Hampshire. I'm on with my guest and friend Noah Rogers of the Platypus Affiliated Society. He's also a writer of essays and a musician. And I thought I'd bring you on today to talk a little bit about music and philosophy.
Yeah, thank you, Dominic. This is exciting. This is my first time in the Liquid Democracy New Hampshire room, uh, the famous room. You've done a couple of videos in this room, no?
I have, yeah,
Yeah,
no, this is
and
my
others in other
sort of regular
locations.
interview spot. Have you
Yeah.
seen some of them? I forget.
I have seen some of them. I've seen more of your, sort of, well, vlogs or video
Mm.
essays or what you might call it, where you're out in the woods talking. And I've seen the thumbnails of the interviews, but I haven't watched many of the interviews that I can remember. Um, yeah. So, anyways, like Dominic said, I'm a member of Platypus, the Platypus Affiliated Society. I'm not really representing Platypus on this interview, but also that's I think something that in Platypus is generally understood and that outside of Platypus is generally not understood. Like, for instance, Chris Catrone will go and do all these, various podcast appearances, you know, um, sometimes not even with avowedly left wing podcasters, but recently I
Mm.
saw you were commenting on the P.F. Young
Oh yeah, yeah,
podcast with Chris Catrone.
yeah.
And it's just, often taken as implicitly understood that like this isn't necessarily platypus activity, although of course there's some overlap in terms of the kinds of thoughts that he's going to be expressing, and so that's kind of what I think I'm going to be doing here, right? Like insofar as you mentioned that I write essays, uh, what I've been struggling with recently, and I think I sent you a version of this essay I was writing
Yes.
about rap music, and I think what was you know on the one hand, I think rap music as this sort of ubiquitous popular musical form now, that even as we're like getting over it and it's like, oh, rap music is dead, right? You hear these kinds of things sometimes, like it's not 2017 or whatever when Migos was super popular,
Mm.
and yet we still seem to have like these rap isms that have become like a big part of our musical language. Like pop music tends to have like these lyrics that have a sort of more myopic focus, and there's less room for like as I was rereading, because you mentioned to me the other night Adorno's
Mm.
essay on jazz, right? And it occurred to me like, wow, like how exciting jazz seems, even in Adorno's estimation and his critical assessment, in contradistinction to what rap music is today. And so I don't know if it's even I think that the rap music essay that I did might end up becoming more of just like a personal reflection, which I will kind of leave on the shelf, because in a certain way it's like me also as a musician, as an artist, trying to work through like my sort of mental habits, right? My musical habits that come from whatever psychological thing, not just having been exposed to a certain type of music, but having had a certain reaction to it as well. Like I didn't listen to rap music really at all until
Mm.
probably when I was maybe 15 or 16. And before that, I was very into like some sort of classical stuff, but mostly like prog rock of the 70s.
Mm.
And
That's pretty ubiquitous, the prog rock.
yeah, you wanna say something about that? Like, what's
Yeah, I
your
mean,
experience, if anything, with that kind of?
so I think prog rock is probably our dad's generation's music in a lot of ways. I mean,
Yeah.
I grew up with a really broad taste in music from my father, who's like a big music guy, and my whole family listened to pretty much every genre. And so, on a basic level, I had like a surface level understanding of every different genre of music. But there
Mm.
were some things I didn't really touch. Like you said, you didn't listen to rap until you were maybe like 16 or 17. I didn't really listen to a lot of rap music. If I did, it was like Will Smith rap music, like
Mm.
old cheesy rap music, you
Yeah.
know. Um, and even when I got into rap music, I got into a lot of like Watsky and Spose. And did you know any of them?
I don't know them. What are they like?
I mean, they get labeled a lot of the time very simply like racially labeled as like the white rappers. They're
Oh, okay.
Very Eminem in energy.
Yeah.
That's probably a better touchstone. But when you say like rap isms in music, are you talking about the musical flares, or are you talking about, because you said something about like the lyrics are kind of myopic?
Yeah, and I think both, and they are associated in a certain way. Um, one maybe like too easy way of thinking about and characterizing rap music um, would be so let's maybe take this idea, but also hold it at a certain distance. It might not be entirely true that everything that Adorno is saying about jazz in the essay on jazz seems to be like even more true of rap music, right? That it
Hmm.
appears to be more free and chaotic, perhaps even, and yet it's more, standardized. It has a series of tricks, and even the lyrics, right? Like, I think Adorno mentions that in jazz there was ample room for, this sort of like silly, nonsensical innuendo. And you do still get that in rap music, but it has to fall into like a uh, certain schematics so that people can assimilate it, right? Like the fact that all of rap music relies on like rhymes and like
Hmm.
puns, I think is like, there's a sense in which jazz seemed too free, right? Because it's like, okay, there's this series of tricks that you can do, and you can pass them off as improvisation. Maybe in some sense they are improvisation. Maybe there are genuinely moments, there definitely are, where jazz musicians just go out on a limb and you know aren't merely relying on certain musical motifs that they're just configuring in different ways. um, but even then the question of like, how do you determine which of these jazz musicians or which of these performances is better than another one? you know how do we make our Mount Rushmore? How do we canonize who are the good and bad jazz musicians? Not to just to do it, but just to have some sort of orientation about like, what is this art form? um, that immediately presents a problem of like, you have to talk about jazz the way that you would talk about a Jackson Pollock painting, where you seem to be dealing in like abstractions that are irrational in some way.
Hmm.
Of like, okay, you can say it's dynamic and that it like, all these sorts of things, and yet what is the point of that? Anything can be dynamic. um, but this is actually right, like, so maybe what's interesting about rap music is that where jazz had to, you know, in order to have the semblance of this very free form, uh, really it's relying on a lot of conventions
Hmm.
that don't change that much and that are essential to the listener being able to make their way through the song. Um, and in rap, it seems to have gotten, maybe not freer, but more chaotic. Maybe it seems freer in a way as well, because instead of speaking in innuendo in rap music, you can just explicitly say certain things. Um, you know, that's something to think about too. But this is not, once again, right? This comes at the cost of like uh, a sort of slavishness to convention, which in rap music has kind of become all but second nature. It's not even something that people really even have to study, right? You can just kind of listen to a little bit of rap music, and
Mm.
then you can kind of start freestyling, right?
Right.
Especially like recent rap music, where there's a sort of ambiguity between, is this ironic? Are the bars supposed to be bad and silly? Or is it something else? Is it okay to just rhyme, certain expletives with each other over and over and over? Um, and so that, I think, we could say maybe is like the Lil B, and then kind of later bookending this, maybe somebody like Xavier So Based. So like
Mm.
basically straddling the 2010s, right? There was this moment in rap music where there seemed like there was a lot of possibility for the art form to go in these new weird directions. And ultimately, that innovation didn't really pan out. It didn't really turn into anything. It kind of reproduced, there was, I mean, there, basically one way of putting it is there was a younger generation of rappers who were suspect of like, okay, you have to have the most deep, profound bars or whatever, and it's about what level of wordplay can you do and these references you can make, like you're trying to get a good score on a test, and then you get Lil B, Young Thug, Chief Keef, or whatever. The
Mm.
kind of the kind of effect of that music is like taking the test and ripping it up, and like just going outside for the rest of the period to smoke whatever cigarettes, or
Or drink your lean in this
drink your
case.
lean, probably is a more accurate example. Yeah, and so the reason I felt inclined to kind of write about rap music in this essay I was doing uh, was really that I was trying to do something which I suspected was impossible, but I wanted to try it, of just like trying to come up with almost a manifesto, like a positivistic almost take on like what should musicians who care about music be doing right now. Um, and It's positivistic in this weird sense, right? Because the essay doesn't come to any conclusions about like, well, these are the formal characteristics that like a new music should have. But what we do end up with at the end of the essay is sort of an idea of like, well, rap is expressing something, the dialectical cliche, and yet it is, you know, true, right? Like, rap is expressing something genuine, but it's doing it in a way that, you know, um, is too unconscious and too deliberately unconscious, too like, uh,
It doesn't want
deliberate,
to
yeah.
think about itself. It doesn't want to consider itself.
Yeah, it wants to obfuscate what it's doing. And,
Mm.
I think I used the word narcissism in the essay, which I went and revised, and I was inclined to, sort of specify more what I meant by that. Not that narcissism was necessarily the wrong word to describe certain aspects of rap music, um, but merely that it's so easy to perhaps be misinterpreted by Gen Z,
Mm.
because the word narcissism comes to mean like, well, it comes to mean something different from what it would have meant for Freud, right, classically. um, Namely this sort of this infantile sort of like refusal to come to compromises with the outside world. um, and This, I think, is something that rap music, right, like does and yet doesn't do consciously enough, right? Because of course, musically, it does make compromises to, you know, why should a young person growing up who wants to be a rapper have to view Chief Keef as a genius and like have to genuflect to that
Mm.
because of this like moment that has already passed. And if you listen to Chief Keef's music now, it's already like whatever was interesting about it has kind of already been liquidated into his own personal desire to be like a great rapper or whatever, which is just like very awkward because he's not like the wordplay genius or whatever of somebody like who would be an example? I don't know, Biggie or
Mm.
RZA or
I
whoever.
mean, I'd give it to Eminem too in the mix,
Eminem would be
right?
another good example.
Right,
Yeah,
because he was depthful and playful in a lot of his lyrics. I mean, the rhyme schemes, if you color them, there's like those videos where they do the colorized rhyme schemes. If you've seen those,
yeah, I've seen those.
there's a lot of different colors in an Eminem song. I feel like a Chief Keef song might just be two or three.
Yeah, it wouldn't. It probably wouldn't have the same reading rainbow effect, so to speak. But yeah, I think maybe we'll come back to that uh, thought I was having in a minute. But the other thing that comes up, right, is like the sort of elephant in the room of the question of like black and white in rap
Hmm.
and, being a black rapper versus being a white rapper or being whatever. And something I've also noticed is just like I said, I mean, there's just a desire to reproduce certain, like, a very kind of childish desire to, like, well, this is tricky. How should I word this? There's a desire to just get to say bad things or nasty things or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
you know? And I think what white rappers often end up making this compromise, which is unspoken, but everybody understands that this is what you're doing as a white rapper, is you're like, I'm not going to say the N word. However, I now get to say all these other things that I couldn't say as a country singer or whatever,
Mm.
And the fact is, you could say these things many as a country singer, perhaps, You could you could also probably say the N word as a country singer,
Right.
but like there's this idea of like being a rapper and rap music as like the most hip cutting edge thing um, that is because of this appearance of also what Adorno describes jazz as creating, like the appearance of immediacy. It's not really creating an immediacy of like total spontaneity, right? Of like the rapper goes into the booth and then creates something that's totally self-sufficient, like art that you know exists only in reference to itself, right, and sort of against the world. Um, no, there's like a huge, sort of capitulation to social reality in jazz and also in rap. And in rap, it becomes like kind of more obvious in a certain way. Like the exaggeration becomes so ridiculous that if you just take like two steps away from it and view it from a certain distance, then you can see how kind of ridiculous it is. One example I would think of is like, you know, and this is also where I wonder like, is there critical value to what I'm saying here? Are these just like, you know, thoughts about rap music? But I think also there's actually a lot of taboo around rap music. So just saying some like emperor has no clothes type stuff about it, I think is actually valuable, even if it doesn't constitute, right, like uh, a real sort of productive step towards a critique of rap music or towards a theory of rap music in the same way that Adorno is working on like this idea of a theory of jazz music. And do we need a theory of rap music, right? or is it just everything that Adorno described in On Jazz and On Popular Music, his other essay, which kind of goes hand in hand with On Jazz in conceptually, for me at least.
Yeah,
Where are we going with it?
I
But
think
yeah, go ahead.
I think that when so I actually, in order to research for this interview, looked into some other people going over on jazz, like philosophy people, and the leftists who went over it, because they were leftists. That's why they're interested in reading Adorno in a podcast that went over it. Were very interested in asterisking the whole conversation with, hey everybody, I'm gonna let you know right up front, Adorno's a racist. Like they actually came in with that right up front,
which is so
and an
unfortunate
elitist too.
that you can't do that.
Was the other thing, right?
You can't just take Adorno seriously. It's sad, not even for a minute, right?
And the basis of it is that he's talking about jazz music specifically, or at least in their minds, they're seeing him as kind of singling out jazz, and jazz is of course like a black art form historically in a lot of ways,
right? Which Adorno also disputes, right, in an interesting way. So it's like he's racist because he doesn't like the black art form, but he's also racist because he suggests that it might not be a black art form, right? And so
is that because it's sort of democratized, that the listener
right, well that's one thing, is that it's democratized in the sense that all classes and races of people listen to jazz music in the era being described. It's also worth noting, people will often say, oh, maybe Adorno would have changed his tune about jazz had he lived to the 60s and 70s, and you could hear Miles Davis and like Ornette Coleman and whatever. And I think that's questionable, but we'll get into it. But anyways, what was the thing we were talking about before? The jazz is whether it's a black art form.
Exactly.
And the idea is that it's black because it represents like a certain vitality that could be, that could re-energize or that could displace in a productive way, like Western classical music, like the European classical tradition. And Adorno is just quick to point out, right, like jazz is not like slave songs. Jazz is not the spontaneous outpouring of whatever artistic expression by the oppressed. It's it has its origins largely in classical music. I mean, kind of entirely, in a certain sense. I mean, it has these Adorno makes this point, right? Like if you listen to the indigenous music of Africa, it doesn't sound like blues or jazz, even if you get very specific and go to like West Africa, you hear stuff that, people will engage in the fantasy that it's like blues when they hear like people playing the guitar in the desert, and there's these very like the very pentatonic sort of feel, but it's not, that doesn't make it blues any more than like Chinese music is blues, and another thing, right? Like this isn't in the essay necessarily, but like Scott Joplin, right? Scott Joplin, the composer, often credited with kind of being the father of ragtime, and therefore with all these other musical developments that come after it, did not see himself as a composer of rag, whatever, or of jazz, or of like this new, black whatever. He saw himself as a composer of marches in the perhaps not an explicitly European tradition either, but just in this more universal tradition, right? And to give up on that and say, well, actually, here's this thing that we have to respect because it like has this archaic value, right? It's like going back to nature and spontaneity, and in the process making this just like flatly racist connection between black people and like spontaneity and nature and magic or whatever.
Mm.
Um, you know, but you can't really think, you know, it's ironic, right, that people blame the Frankfurt School nowadays for critical race theory,
Mm.
right? Because what that term came to mean was an absolute, you know, absence of critical consciousness of like race as a historical thing. Like you couldn't talk about jazz in this way, right? Adorno
Right.
is seen as racist for writing this essay, which is, you know, I mean, it's just a cope. I mean, on one level, you have to understand that a lot of the time the left doesn't believe what they say. I bet a lot of those people on podcasts or whatever, if you got them behind closed doors and were talking in private, you know, maybe with a few drinks or whatever, would be
Mm.
like, yeah, you know, it's not that Adorno is wrong, it's just that you can't say that stuff. You know,
Mm.
I think that that is really, you know, something that I've encountered, not specifically with the On Jazz essay, but there are just lots of examples of, you know, the left doesn't want to show any cracks. And it's like, as a result, they actually, you know, are enfeebled not only in the ability to think critically, but politically as well, because there's this, you know, I mean, the to jump to like the obvious example, maybe not obvious, but the example of Trump, right? And that like Trump had an easier time taking over the Republican Party and reshaping it into this powerful force than he would have if he had tried to do it in the Democrats, even though he was a Democrat for most of his life. And the proof in the pudding is that Bernie Sanders tried to do more or less that with the Democrats and failed, right? And he was kind of okay with that because he did not expect it to succeed.
Mm.
Um, and so, you know, this is maybe taken us a little far from the jazz thing, but I guess we're talking on two levels now. One of like, you know, what does Adorno's On Jazz essay have to say to us today if we really take it seriously and don't just go like, oh, well, maybe there's interesting thoughts between the lines and in the footnotes, but we take it for granted that the whole thing is racist and therefore worthless, you know, from the outset. It's just a historical curiosity that Adorno, the smart
Mm.
guy, could have made these bad, you know. And nowadays people don't even, you know, respect Adorno in the same way that like in 2020, right? I think that critical theory, right, had this sort of, I mean, we could talk about it in Zoomer terms, like bread tube or whatever,
Mm-hmm.
you know, that there were many of these channels that were happy to, you know, just cite like Marx and Nietzsche and Foucault and Adorno and then Angela Davis or whatever in the same video essay, giving the listener the impression that they're all, you know,
On
uh,
the same page.
yeah. And of course, it's not that they're from totally separate worlds or that there's nothing that they have in common, right? But this it created a sort of false like idea of like left intellectual unity where it's like these guys might have had these crazy ideas which shock you, but they all share in one thing, right? Which is that they think that, you know, fascism is bad and this and that, blah blah
Mm.
blah. So like the idea of like we can have our crazy interesting reasoning, but like don't worry, it will end in us saying Donald Trump is bad. Like don't worry, right?
Never you fear that
Yeah,
we're gonna
never
hold
you
that
fear.
line.
Right. And so, you know, the thing with jazz that's maybe peculiar is the way that it's become now sort of institutionalized, academicized. You
Mm.
know, this is, you know, not something that Adorno lived through really, but, you know, the culture nowadays of like, you know, you can go and study jazz at a university and you can study jazz improvisation at the university.
Yep.
And these kinds of things, uh, I don't take it so much as like that killed jazz as like that was where this kind of thing was going. Um, and the reason I think it was going in that sort of direction is that is a similar reason for why like modernism in painting or like avant-garde art got institutionalized as like MoMA modernism, Museum of Modern Art modernism. Uh, namely that at a certain point, it had to, there were a lot of people who wanted to hang on to like its significance but couldn't really articulate it, because in some ways as art it's going beyond, even jazz, right? When we're talking about jazz in these very critical terms, there's still something about jazz which can't just be expressed in, you know the form of an essay, right? And Adorno is aware of this, right? There's still something about it as art that goes beyond mere like positive descriptions or even critical writing. Um, and yet, right, to try to uh, preserve that, what you end up having to do is saying, like, oh, well, it's good because it has technique, and these are the techniques that it uses. And
Mm.
so, whatever might have been genuinely spontaneous about jazz between the lines kind of gets wrung out, even though it doesn't seem like that, right? Improvisation is still like, but then you get like a theory of improvisation, right? Which, how strange that idea is, I think, is lost on people, and not just in the sense that you could never have something like that, that you could never have theoretical underpinnings that influence your action or whatever. I think this is how most people conceive of what you're supposed to do nowadays, right? You're supposed to have like theory, which is plan and ideas behind your actions, and then your actions should kind of be true to that theory. I think the left and the right believes this now, right? And doesn't see them as being fundamentally uh, opposed, unless you're just like a weak-willed person or something, right? Unless you're just like a morally bad person. But the truth
Mm.
of the matter is that, getting back to the art example, or you could also, take the political example of theory and practice, spontaneity versus organization. There has been a real split between these things, um, which is not just on the individual level of people are too narcissistic, maybe, or whatever, to really dig into these things and come up with the correct orientation on issues of theory and practice. But that when you try to do it, you actually run into these roadblocks, right? Like the sort of stiff version of jazz that gets carried on in the form of like academicized jazz was an attempt to save its vitality from what might have been like its natural course and its like natural beautiful death at a certain moment.
Mm.
um, and what also has to be talked about, I think, in this context is like free jazz, or like the seeming revolutionizing of jazz in the 60s and 70s, whether it be just like weird fusion Miles Davis type stuff, or Ornette Coleman, right? I mean, there's one thing that Adorno says, um, which is that jazz has this, could be seen as the amalgamation, although it's not really this, he says, but it has this uh, seeming amalgamation of like march music and salon music. So like this music that's a very free expression of individuality, and then this music that is like lockstep, sort of
Mm.
inspires feelings of collectivity and perhaps conformity, and perhaps group pride or whatever. And that jazz has sort of pushed these two things together. And what I think is interesting about the example of Ornette Coleman, right, is that um, especially in early Ornette Coleman like discography, even when the trumpet or the saxophone might be doing like something very crazy that seems to me just, so far outside of what could be described in music theory or jazz theory or whatever, just like this kind of super spontaneous, almost id playing.
Mm.
Still, you have the drums like playing out a very clear, you know, not what you would think of as a marchable rhythm, but of course it is. Um, and so, these questions of rhythm on the other side, became very important to the Darmstadt school, which was, kind of contemporary to, slightly after what we think of, well, not really, because the Frankfurt School, if we think of the Frankfurt School as like 40s to 60s, that's the maybe, peak. The Darmstadt School is roughly contemporary. I think it's founded in 1951 or 52
And this
or
is a
something.
school of music or of philosophy?
Of music, yes. So the
Okay.
Darmstadt School, composers like Karl-Heinz Stockhausen, Luciano Berio, Pierre Boulez, and also at a certain point, Darmstadt kind of. So Darmstadt was like high modernism, like crazy intense modernism
Okay.
that kind of in the late 60s and 70s and all that began, with the dissolution of the New Left, kind of concurrently was going through this dissolution aesthetically and theoretically into sort of something more postmodern in the sense of like maybe it doesn't matter, right, that every note have its specific role and inalienable place in the composition, right? Maybe we should open things up, right? And maybe this like capital R reason, this rationality and this sort of universal thinking that has produced like serialism, sort of in an academic form. Maybe that's actually the obstacle, right? And we should.
Serialism?
So serialism, yeah, I guess is a term that I should define. Um, and this is I was going to put it in a pithy way and say like maybe the opposite of jazz, but that wouldn't be really fair. So serialism emerges as basically emerges out of musical late romanticism and like musical expressionism when composers are starting to find that the old rules of tonality, right? You have a tonal center, and then you move away from it a little bit to create excitement, but then you're ultimately going back to it, and the listener has these sort of preconceived notions that are going to create a sort of psychological pull back to the tonal center, and the music, uh, you know, I think people often see tonal music as like, oh, well, this is just because this is a popular tradition of making music in this way, and it's actually arbitrary and random. But, in works by like Bach or Beethoven, what you get is like, particularly in Beethoven, right? If we're thinking historically, you get this sort of apotheosis of tonality where Beethoven is taking these things that, of course, are not purely things he came up with out of thin air. He didn't invent 12-tone equal temperament or the major or minor scale or whatever. But he's creating these works that seem to be totally self-motivated using these tools, right? So they seem to have this internal coherence. Every note makes sense with respect to every other note, not just if you know music theory or whatever that comes outside, but there's something, or even if you're just culturally exposed to whatever Baroque music, Romantic music, but that there's something integral about these compositions. And even late Beethoven, right, which is like the 1820s, right, so before Marx, before any of that, starts to see like tonality dissolving a little bit in the sense of like the clear tonal center is it's not that it has disappeared and that late Beethoven is like atonal or something, but that it is becoming harder and harder to uh, identify and kind of late Beethoven is known as being harsh on the ears, like his late string music and stuff. So all this being a broader part of romanticism in music and in art, where all of a sudden, we're coming up with these things that, as a result of this sort of incipient alienation, of individuals and of society from the things that they're producing. There's a sense in which composers are starting to write things which their audience cannot immediately understand, right? You could
Mm.
say this is true in the Baroque era. Oh, Bach, who the hell is going to understand Bach? It's so complicated. But the logic of it is immediately apparent, right? Whereas as the Romantic era continues, you get these things which, to us nowadays, because they're pastiche and we've heard them in various contexts and they remind us maybe of like a refined musical tradition that's gone or whatever,
Mm.
they sound normal and easy on our ears. Debussy is maybe the great example. Debussy now I feel like people see as like relaxing, lo-fi, hip hop, whatever. That's how people interpret that music. But of course, at the time, there was something very jarring about it. The sort of impressionism, a series of images which actually aren't actually going to bring you necessarily to a satisfactory end, and which don't necessarily have a necessary relationship to one another, other than being images that images metaphorically, but musical moments that Debussy liked and decided to juxtapose with one another. Um,
So,
so serialism, sorry,
mhm.
so serialism emerges out of late Romanticism in the 1910s, basically, and it's a method of composing where essentially we're trying to create something more dynamic and less predictable than what tonal music can create. But we also want to have some sort of logic and structure to it. We don't want to just be, kind of floating without a compass. And so, what for Schoenberg was sort of a temporary technical fix, this idea of like, we're going to repeat or not repeat, rather, uh, each note of the 12 note chromatic scale. They can be in different octaves or whatever. We're not going to repeat them until we've cycled through all of them, right? In the music as a whole, so you might have moments where you have one melodic line or you have multiple melodic lines, but they're like sharing in this sort of thing. And you can get pretty crazy with it. But what became, what for Schoenberg was sort of a momentary kind of tool. Schoenberg was like a tinkerer, kind of like a ridiculous inventor who would just come up with these random things that even he felt were maybe not valuable. Like he made some like variant of chess, which he was ashamed to show to, I think, Emanuel Lasker. I don't remember, some chess master. There's a funny story about it. But anyways, so Schoenberg, what for Schoenberg was a technique that had its moment and which he actually kind of abandoned later on, not exactly with a return to like conventional tonality, but just with this sort of new, harder to define, more ambiguous musical language that seems just more confident in itself. Um, the Darmstadt school took up, you know, the sort of logical conclusion of the 12-tone method of this not repeating note stuff, became formalized into a musical technique known as serialism.
Okay.
And so the
Let me
I'm trying to think how I got here from
let me
jazz.
make sure
But
I'm let me
go
make
ahead and
sure I'm
interrupt
keeping
me.
up
Go
here.
ahead and interrupt me.
So I think so. If I'm grasping at it, is there a bit of a parallel between this history of the tonal music, sort of having an outgrowth in this more atonal music? Is there a parallel between that and the way that today's listeners to music, like I myself, when I listen to music, early on, I got a basis for all these different genres. And then as I listened to music more and more, I felt that I required a subversion of form increasingly. Started to listen to more indie music because I felt like it was
Mm,
subverting the tropes that were present within more mainstream music. And then at a certain point, I get sort of ground down to the point where I'm listening to like a fan blowing, like it's
yeah,
like, and I'm like, oh, this is like the
I
most
understand
impressive
that.
noise music I've ever heard in my life.
Yeah.
um is
Well,
there an element of a parallel there between the tonal to the late Beethoven sort of less tonal music?
Hmm. I think this is a good question. I would say, you know, what we have there maybe occurs more in like jazz and in the late sort of postmodern turn. And I don't mean postmodern as a dirty word here. The late Darmstadt school stuff is interesting, but nonetheless, a sort of souring or distance from the sort of intense modernism of like Pierre Boulez. So like that stuff emerged at a moment where it was like, okay, this sort of more universal project of music as a form of art, maybe as a unique form of art because it's uniquely abstract, right? You know, a song might have its lyrics or whatever, but it really doesn't have content in the way that a painting has content, especially if it's a symphony or some sort of instrumental piece of music. Um, and so, what I think you're describing is something that I've definitely experienced, but that also I think is more like in the sort of, I won't say it's even post 60s or whatever, because there's like a desire for postmodernism or getting beyond the impasse of modernism, getting beyond the need for, right, like, like why do we have to have this like narrative of history? Why can't it just be like miscellaneous things popping around doing their thing, right? You get this, in Heidegger really in the 20s. You get, so it's not. I don't want to say that postmodernism is this uh, well-defined thing or that it's a thing of the 60s, but just this idea of like a souring towards modernism, I think produces in popular music the form of like jazz and also this idea of like fads, right? Like there's something about rap music which still has this sort of like, polished stone, like a core that is very, very strict
Mm.
musically and which is similar to jazz in that way, even though it's gotten more and more kind of like basic, but also seems to allow for more and more like miscellaneous content to come in, right? Like every rap beat is going to be like 4/4, and it's going to have like these kinds of drums and stuff. But then the sample you loop in the background or whatever what stuff you want to put in the background can be kind of miscellaneous. It can be kind of whatever, right?
It can
And
be
so
any genre of music, which is part of why rap gets integrated into all these other genres too, of pop, of country. It's on the country radio now,
yeah, definitely.
and there's a very formulaic type to current rap ever since like I think it was Triple Six Mafia that started it off, where
Yeah, or like those Memphis guys, right?
there's what is it, Snoop Dogg at one point. He has this great quote where he's talking about the state of rap music today. And he says, "Everybody talking like this now," like to like capture that
Yeah,
flow that became kind of dominant.
right. And it's very interesting. I guess if you listen to like 3 6 Mafia, for example, what you get is like um, it is this very pragmatic sort of phrasing where it's like we're going to do whatever rhythm is necessary to get this sentence into this span of
Mm.
time. um, and so you know uh, rhythm subservient to language um, becomes like, well, it's a step away from a sort of more like a higher concept of art or music. And that's not to say that we don't need to struggle through like, some of these inconsistencies and confusing parts, and that we just need to have like formalism, right? Like the best art possible would be Malevich's, suprematism and his white square and stuff. I don't think that's necessarily true. Um, but we have to like call a spade and get beyond this idea of like, you know, because there does seem to be like a promise of freedom and the idea of like we've invented this musical form where you can literally plug anything into it, right? And that
Mm.
seems to be its spontaneous part. I mean, to cut to the chase of what Adorno is talking about in On Jazz, right? He gets very psychoanalytic and talks about, you know, castration, and jazz is the music. The jazz subject is one who has accepted castration,
Mm.
and now he has nothing to lose and he can enjoy the party and the fun and be spontaneous, right? He gives up something, he agrees to be, you know this this certain kind of totalized subject, um, and then he gets to express himself in the part of the song where you're allowed to improvise or whatever. Or, and Adorno talks about jazz, dancing, and all these kinds of things that I'm less familiar with. I couldn't tell you how people were dancing to jazz in the 40s. I mean, I have a vague image in my head of what it might have looked like, but anyways,
And
this,
I,
yeah,
yeah,
I think
I think
rap music
this.
does that too, and we should. Sorry to interrupt you,
Oh yeah,
but
yeah.
we should uh, be aware of, but also wary of that seemingly emancipatory possibility in jazz or rap music where you have this structure and then you can just insert anything into it, and so that makes it more free. Because what it also makes it is more everything's more interchangeable, right? Everything's more unnecessary and superfluous, right?
Hmm.
Um, that kind of sounds like Marx. But what were you gonna say?
Yeah, I mean, so that's, I think that's, you've kind of already said it, but I want to make it a little bit more explicit for the audience too. That part of the reason that I invited you for this conversation is that there is this parallel between Adorno's musicology and his political theory, where
Mm,
in like the marginalia to theory and practice, a lot of his concerns feel parallel to his concerns about music. His worry that theory has become subject to practice, that we're just going to sort of stifle our critical thinking skills to the practice of the moment.
mm,
And there's this sense in which when the people who are reading Adorno read him, they're hearing him singling out jazz music. But I feel like maybe a better go-to would be to say, to look to his feelings on like Elvis Presley and other stuff like that. He wasn't fond of that either,
right.
and it's because of that sort of democratization, as I understand it, of music, which is very similar in his mind to the attempt to democratize theory, to create forms of theory that are popular to what people are already doing.
Mm-hmm.
Theory as a justification for what one is already going to do as action, instead of a way to consider your actions more deeply.
Right. And in this On Jazz essay, Adorno mentions the pseudo democratic character of jazz, which has a number of aspects to it, but one of them is the sense in which it seems to be like the popular music of the moment, like everybody's just clamoring to hear this music, everybody likes this music.
Mm.
And yet, it's not exactly, oh, that the overlords have determined this is the song that's going to play on the radio today to brainwash everybody, but rather that the whatever social mechanism is determining what jazz songs are hits and what jazz songs are not and go in the garbage. It's a really opaque social mechanism. Like, honestly, nobody, neither a theoretician, Adorno compares it to the stock market, right? Like, you could no more predict based on its musical characteristics which jazz song is going to be a hit or which performance or whatever
Mm.
than you could predict which stocks and bonds are going to go up and down in the next month or next year, right? Like, it is that same kind of opaque social mechanism. And so that's the pseudo democratic character of it. In other words, like, if there was a real sort of democratic character to it, that wouldn't necessarily solve all of the problems, but it would at least allow us to think about a sort of deeper problem of like, okay, the music is not just pantomiming like this interface with reality because it can't accept how isolated it is from reality, but it, genuinely comes into contact with reality and maybe with disastrous results, right?
Mm.
Like the beginnings of the sort of socialist workers movement are things that nowadays are pejoratives and are seen as stupid, like being a Luddite, for example.
Mm.
And so, but at the same time, there's something so much better in that moment. I don't want to say better because maybe it's like, who's to say? But
Mm.
there's something historically so much more interesting about being some Luddite worker in the early 19th century who's smashing machines because, they're taking jobs, even though that's, we look at that today as like, that's very misguided. And there are people who also reproduce it happily. but
Right.
like, But like, there's something about that that's so much more authentic than like being a sort of bourgeois defender of order in that moment.
I mean, there's also today the way that practice would function is everybody would line up. Everybody would line up to get the machines, and they'd get their little protest permit, and everybody would line up, and they'd all smash a little computer, and they'd
Right.
make sure they got it on camera that they smashed the computer as a
Yeah.
Luddite,
I
to show
participated in
everybody.
something like that recently.
Oh yeah.
Well, not exactly that, but like, you know, just like a May Day event where it's like,
Oh, did you
it,
go to the May Day?
yeah, I went to the one in Manchester,
Oh, okay, yeah,
and
yeah. I
I
saw
might
that
have
online
it
a
might
little
have been
bit.
that there was rain and that I showed up a little late, but it did seem like nobody was just passing through the park, curious to see what the Congress of Workers Organizations of New Hampshire had to say, as opposed to the Socialist Rifles Association or
Mm.
whatever. Um, uh, I throw in so many just like extra stupid letters when I talk. The Socialist Rifles, it's the Socialist Rifle Association, I think.
Yeah, yeah.
But, anyways, it kind of like pantomiming, connecting with the community by going out with like a bullhorn, which people are happy to ignore. Because
Yeah.
people in the city already ignore, the sirens that they hear and the shouting and the this or the that or the whatever, you know, the sound of a concert, over yonder. And
And when people do happen by, there's a sense in which they've violated this thing. We're here to go visit the community, and then the community shows up.
yeah,
Somebody
and
shows
people are
up,
like,
and they're
what
like,
the
"Whoa,
hell?
who's this guy?
What do we do
Who's this
now?
guy? He's not one of us. What's he doing here?"
Yeah.
I've had that happen where like a guy, it was like I think it was just like a guy who was kind of broke and at the bus stop, and it was right at the same part. And he
Mm-hmm.
goes and he's riding his bike by, and he's like, "Hey, what are you guys about?" And everybody's like terrified because nobody wants to say, "Oh, we're about communism,"
Wow.
and have this guy like yell at them because the guy had
Yeah.
like an American flag on his bike, and they were getting like vaguely right wing vibes from him. And I
Yeah.
walked over and said hi, and everybody looked at me funny. Like, whoa, why are you saying hi to that guy?
Right. Yeah, they just like if you don't have the confidence to, bring your message to people other than the people who already believe it, you know. And this could be different in a hypothetical, situation where there is some kind of real workers movement and it's like, okay, we're not trying to convince the bourgeoisie of anything. What we are trying to do is be
Mm.
critical. We're imminent to the movement and we're trying to, influence the workers' movement itself. That might be different, but you know, right in a world where maybe we could say post 1917, post Russian Revolution, there is this genuine split between theory and practice, where attempts to just mush them back together into a productive relationship again ends up producing these, sometimes disastrous results and other times just kind of uninspiring, whatever. Uh, what was I saying?
Hmm.
about
Well, something else I wanted to raise too
yeah,
about the
sure.
the parallels between the music and the politics was, I think you said it earlier, but there is this spontaneity versus organization. You could even frame it as like libertarian left versus authoritarian left or something like that. Those debates that take place within politics. But then there's also the same sort of spontaneity versus organization, and we seem to kind of go back and forth between those poles, right? We have an era of organization. We react with an era of spontaneity, both in
Mm,
music and in politics,
right.
but we'll never get away from
Yeah, like punk and then sort of clean new wave and then grunge, right, or whatever.
it, right?
Just to bring a silly example. But yeah, you see these sorts of, so this is what I was alluding to before, like you said, like you eventually want your expectations to be subverted,
Mm.
right? And I do want to kind of defend the idea that like Schoenberg and serialism, even in its very sort of rigid, you know, Darmstadt school form, which in some ways was less rigid than it is often made out to be, but I don't know if we have time to get into the subtleties of it. That this music had a consciousness of itself as participating in some sort of historical project and having a responsibility on that basis to innovate, but also to like innovate meaningfully. In other
Mm.
words, um, like Pierre Boulez was authentically Pierre Boulez was one of the Darmstadt school composers, was very authentically frustrated with the fact that he would produce this music which involved these very complex pre-compositional procedures with mathematics and deciding which notes are going to do which things, um, and the end results are, to the ears, maybe to trained ears they're different, maybe to the like four people in the world who have spent their entire
Mm.
lives studying like whatever, um, but to untrained ears, and that's like almost all ears, you know, probably even to the trained ears, it's difficult to differentiate without prior knowledge a piece by Pierre Boulez from a piece by American composer John Cage, who
Mm.
famously worked with chance, and he wouldn't have called it randomness, but that might be, indeterminacy, right? In other words, there's some element of the composition which is left open, not necessarily to improvisation, but to chance and uncertainty. That we don't know exactly how it's going to sound when it comes out. That's Cage's later period. Or just like the notes themselves are rigid and defined, but by some random pre-compositional procedure. And so the idea is, um, John Cage writes this piece, Music of Changes, around the same time that Pierre Boulez writes, this is the 50s, Pierre Boulez writes a piano piece called Structures. And Pierre Boulez was dissatisfied with this piece Structures, and in some ways, some of its aesthetic insufficiencies get remedied in later Boulez. But, anyways, the two pieces sound very similar, and Boulez's is written, with these very complex sort of serialist pre-compositional procedures, and also, during the compositional process. And the John Cage piece, Music of Changes, was written using the I Ching, the
Mm.
Chinese, book of divination and these kinds of things. Essentially, I don't know exactly what his process was, but it almost doesn't matter, right? He was introducing a random element, not for randomness' sake, but to kind of challenge the listener to like not be listening to music actually in a narrative way. Can we listen to music in a way that eschews expectation and just live moment to moment in the sound, experience each sound as it is? John Cage was also very influenced by Zen and stuff like that, and so I think it could be easier to make him into like the musical Heidegger or something. I think it's a
Mm.
bit more complex than that, actually. And another essay I've been thinking of writing is about sort of the New York school versus the Darmstadt school, which is to say, in the 50s and 60s. In Europe, you had this sort of hardcore serialism, which was cracking at the edges and becoming postmodernism. For instance, György Ligetis, I don't know how to say his Hungarian name, but
Mm.
his son uh, ended up, completely abandoning the sort of Western classical tradition, which is still kind of implicit even when Boulez is, criticizing even Schoenberg for being too, romantic and, for taking on these classical forms that imminently were, needed to be destroyed and turned into something else. But Lucas Ligeti, the son of Georgi Ligeti, now just makes like, uh, for lack of a better term, like African fusion
Mm.
style music, right? And also Steve Reich, who does this sort of like minimalist music that you hear on NPR.
Okay.
Um, you know, it was a student of Luciano Berio, another one of the sort of more maybe postmodern leaning of the Darmstadt school, but still like there was an authentic modernism in Berio's work that shouldn't be just like dismissed. And there's a third example. Oh, just that Philip Glass, also, the minimalist, wrote some serialist compositions as a student and became dissatisfied with it and decided to come up with what became the style he's known for. Um, so I think we should see, you know, the sort of narcissistic impulse in rap, I guess, to come full circle,
Mm.
is this idea of like, whatever inconvenience is in front of me right now, this immediate inconvenience, I should put all my effort into, just doing a big fuck you to that thing. And what you end up with then is like what seems to be artistic progression, but it's kind of these cycles of fads that kind
Mm.
of like, and of course, other theorists have talked about this in other ways, Mark Fisher or whoever, being like, hauntology. Why can't we imagine a future other than just a revival of disco or something to the effect,
Mm.
for example? Um, and I think the reason why we can't in some respects is that it's not always just nostalgia for disco, for example, that might make neo disco become a thing. It's also just like you have these trends and fads and just these moving parts where the only important part of the aesthetic thing is that it's interesting and contrasts with the previous one,
Mm.
you know. And I think, as I kind of wanted to make the argument before, although I don't know if I've fully fleshed it out, but I think people should take seriously the idea that the development from you know, classical to romanticism in music, and then romanticism to kind of like this weird, what you might call expressionism, this brief moment of like Mahler and early Schoenberg, and then serialism, and then the Darmstadt school, and maybe even the New York school stuff of like indeterminacy and these other sorts of like rejections seemingly of modernism, but still like kind of the early form of those rejections of modernism, which was dealing with a higher form of modernism and had sort of a more coherent, uh, you know, critique of modernism. That all that stuff might have had, even that last phase of it, which I think is more questionable, but it all might have had a necessity to it of which thing followed which thing, in which moment, as a response to which imminent demands of the prior sort of musical form, in a way that just isn't the case with like jazz, or just isn't the case with like, as much as I love this kind of music, right? Like, prog rock, right? And the weird neoclassical impulse of prog rock, or, um, I mean, take your pick, right? Like rap music, the various different subgenres, which are distinguished almost entirely by what kind of drum patterns they use. This is like a
Mm.
new thing now of like trap, and then now we have jerk, and we have like,
Jerk. I haven't heard that one yet.
yeah.
I want to make sure I'm keeping up. So you're talking about transition from I think you said like classical to romantic, had a sort of a progression to it. You're saying
Right.
that was maybe a necessary kind of progression. It had a kind of a maybe a historical necessity to it. But then something like jazz, there's a break, and there has been breaks before, but this break is different.
Yeah, or at least here's another way of, putting it, is like, on the one hand, we can't fully accept as like progressive or just good or whatever the progression from classical to romantic to, late romantic and these other things,
Mm.
um, because it now seems to be like a failed project. It now seems to be like, well, that fell apart for obvious reasons, and the necessity for these other, musical styles and traditions is just evinced in the fact that they won out, right? And that
Mm.
there was something insufficient about Beethoven. And now, even if we want to go back and listen to Beethoven, it's really hard to hear Beethoven and not just to hear, you know, the historical debris that's accumulated with the image and association of Beethoven. You hear Beethoven, and you might hear something about like the triumph of the German spirit and mind or something. Or you might hear it as like the working class, right? This is how Beethoven was plausibly interpreted in like the Soviet Union and China. Um, but on the flip side of that, we shouldn't necessarily say that, you know, jazz is like contingent and random, right? In other words, the spontaneity that it aspires to, it doesn't actually get at necessarily. And one thing that Adorno points out about jazz is like the jazz pieces that are most emblematic of it, that are most like show in the starkest critical relief, you know, what are the essential features of jazz, are not, you know, the popular pieces of jazz, right?
Mm.
Whereas there might have been some kind of self-consciousness, might have been, this is the hypothesis, right? There might have been some kind of self-consciousness in, you know, this always kind of uh, uh, in danger of disappearing tradition of like, you know, whatever, Bach, Mozart, Beethoven, right?
Mm.
Arguably Brahms, really Wagner, I guess, before that. But however you want to slice it up and whoever you want to, you know, there's always a precarity to it of like, you get these increasingly like sort of increasingly bohemian, increasingly at, you know, in conflict with their patrons or with the market more broadly in the 19th century. So there's always this sense in which, like, yeah, you know, a butterfly could have landed in Argentina or whatever, and that would have, you know, wiped Beethoven off the face of the earth when he was a child or whatever. And then what would we do, right? So, you know, you can't think of historical necessity in these literal, like, oh, you know, it was ordained that it had to happen, but that there was something manifest more abstractly, which somebody like Mozart or Beethoven actually did a pretty solid job of turning into something that can become an object for, like, you know, consciousness and for, you know, it's pretty clarified, right? Like there's a critical process almost embodied within the work. And I just don't think that we can say that even about this was another topic I kind of wanted to get into, but maybe we've strayed too far. The sort of free jazz thing, or this idea of like, oh, well, maybe Adorno would have been more cool with jazz if he heard the avant-garde jazz of later on. I just don't know. You know, I
Mm.
just don't see that it.
No,
You know,
I don't think it would have changed his mind, and also because like a conception of jazz today is altered, and a conception of jazz today we think of it as like a higher art form. I think most people, if you said you listen to jazz,
yeah,
they're like, oh, you're
right,
like a nerd, you know, like something like that,
right.
and that's a very different
It's
conception.
establishment now.
And that's, you know, that wouldn't really change what jazz was for him on a music theory level. That's just the time kind of change there.
Right. And while I do think that maybe, right, there might be some kind of interesting, like, free improv, right? Or, you know, just these sort of currents within jazz that seem promising and interesting. Um, but they also tend to just kind of, you know, they were, I guess we could say there's a three-way sort of trifecta of things that are converging and starting to sound the same in this period. Not just John Cage, right, like American indeterminacy or whatever, and, you know, European serialism come to be so incomprehensible to the ear as to sound the same, but
Mm.
also free improv, right? And John Cage's music was not really supposed to be improvised because he didn't want the performer to just be able to take their, you know, to express their whatever their psychology in the form of the piece. It was supposed to be something that was indeterminate for the audience, for the performer, for the composer. Um,
Which is very different because if you're
right.
doing
It's the
improv
exact
as
opposite.
the performer,
Right.
right, then there is a sense in which maybe repeating patterns will emerge as a result of a sort of innate fixed feature of music, as a result of just what sounds good,
Right.
what feels comfortable to the improviser. He's going to improvise within what he knows. He's going to improvise within what kind of sounds good to him. Whereas this randomization goes beyond that entirely.
Mm-hmm. Right. You know, and there's an interesting radio program from, I guess, the '60s or something by Glenn Gould, the pianist,
Okay.
where he, you know, he was also a guy who, you know, tried to be sort of like a music critic and think deeply about music and not merely, you know, he wasn't just a pianist. Um, and he did it was called like anti-aliyah, aliyah like the root in like aleatoric, meaning random, which is another term, aleatoric music, that was used to describe like some of this stuff.
Okay.
And you know, he comes to an interesting conclusion somewhere in there where he's like, well, indeterminacy versus improvisation, right? Like versus serialism or whatever, is that like group improvisations, even when they're based on no rules and they're supposed to be free and basically like, you know, don't follow any musical conventions, guys, you know,
Mm.
whether that's implicit or as you know, an instruction given to the group, they tend to have these sort of like repeating swells of sound in a way that actually serialism and sort of proper John Cage style indeterminacy do not. So that's interesting. Um, but you also have, you know, I think moments in the tradition of free improv that are interesting, that at least, you know, are curious, that need to be thought about because they seem to elude that. And, you know, they raise interesting questions of like, what are the performers thinking when they do this stuff? I'm thinking like Derek Bailey and like Han Benink, the drummer. Really, Derek Bailey, I think, is kind of the big guy in that tradition of like free improv that's just, you know, off its rocker, and that you know, raises these questions about like not only sounding the same as other music that might have been composed through a totally different procedure, but you know, just kind of interesting in that it also shows, yeah, you know, when there's something in the air and everybody seems to converge on it, but through totally different like reasoning. I don't know. There's something to note there. There's something to be interested in. Um, and so all I hope is that maybe, you know, popular music, uh, avant-garde music, to the extent that it still exists or maybe could exist in the near future, that they become a bit more conscious of what they're doing. And maybe it's impossible for pop music because part of its appeal is that it doesn't show all its cards, and that it creates a certain pizzazz, a certain like looking a certain way while under the hood it might be something else. But I would hope just that, you know, at least somebody is taking seriously these kinds of things. And so my thing has been recently, I've been thinking about the idea of like works for the listener, meaning like in the 60s and 70s and also in the 50s, you get increasingly these sort of weird scores, uh, which are like don't have notes or don't have things, but have sort of strange instructions to the performer. And in the 60s, with like Fluxus, which kind of had some overlap with John Cage and all that, you get musical works that will just be like very, you know, particular descriptions of things to do, like, you know, climb into the ceiling or something like that, as opposed to here are the notes and you play them, and maybe here's a part where you can improvise, but here's a
Mm.
part where you can't, you know. And so I've been thinking about like, well, rather than that, maybe works for the listener, right? Like instructions to the listener to listen to a certain thing in a certain way. And I was also kind of inspired by listening to like this piece called Composition as Process by John Cage,
Okay.
which essentially has, you know, and he's performing it in front of the audience of like the Darmstadt school. It's essentially his challenge to them, um, where he's kind of telling the audience how they should listen to the piece as it goes. But his speech is also determined by these random indeterminate variables of like, suddenly a sentence will stop and then it picks up like 20 seconds later. And you hear like a clank from the piano, these kinds of things. And so just this idea of like, you know, it might be like registering something real about like music of the romantic period and post romantic, of like we're starting to make these art objects that the audience doesn't understand, and sometimes we as the composer don't even understand. And
Mm.
so the necessity, it's not incomprehensible, you might have a necessity of like uh, a literal like voice of, you know, I don't want to say the father. I don't want to just do psychoanalytic stuff for no reason. But this voice that's telling you, here's how you should listen to this piece of music, I thought that was very interesting. And it has obvious pitfalls, which is that that shit is so annoying, right? Like you couldn't really,
Mm.
you know. But I don't know. So these are some things that have been swishing around my head as of late when I try to think about, the history of art and music, which is kind of divorced in a certain way from even questions of leftist theory or leftist practice or whatever, right? I mean, it's the political avant-garde and the musical or artistic avant-garde go their separate ways at some point between the 1850s and the 1950s, let's say, just because there's a weird sort of like lagging, like the timeline for art and music is not exactly the same. It's not so
Mm.
easy to say
Like it doesn't, the music of an era doesn't necessarily line up with the politics of the era. Is that what you're getting at?
yeah, I think of course there's some sense in which they're always expressing like some sort of abstract thing in their own particular ways. But I guess I'm just trying to caution myself and the viewer against the overly historicist kind of reading of history, especially recent history, where it's like, well, of course this thing happened that way because it occurred in that era. And these things that look different are actually the same because they both occurred in the year 1914 or whatever, right? Like that, we can easily take the historicism to like a reified, like just too far sort of thing, where it doesn't tell us anything anymore.
Yeah.
Reified
So
isn't really even the word I'm trying to use there, but anyways, go ahead.
there are some things. So I'm in I'm in Platypus reading group, and there are some concepts that I want to learn more about. So I'm going to use this as an advantage, as an opportunity to do that now. Historicism and this. I feel like I've heard some things be said out of the mouths of like Spencer Leonard and stuff, that we're sort of still in modernism, that really that the postmodernists think they're beyond it, but in fact we're still in the modern era, and these thinkers are thinking of themselves as beyond it. Perhaps they're not. Perhaps they're
Mm.
actually more of modernism. Is that? Do you agree with that? How do you feel about those sorts of sentiments?
Yeah, I mean, perhaps this isn't exactly what Spencer was saying. I don't know the particular context of it.
I
But I
very
kind
well
of,
may have
when
misinterpreted
I
it.
hear like postmodernism, it's not that I'm like, oh, I'm against that. I kind of don't believe that it's a thing. I think it's
Mm.
just kind of like modernism in its moment of crisis, and then it kind of throws up its hand and says we're going to give up the ghost. But unfortunately, it doesn't cease to be modernist therein, right? Because art never had to be like, oh, you get the smartest philosopher who knows the most about aesthetics and you have him make a piece of art. You know, some of the most radical and interesting composers or authors or artists have had very weird, peculiar ideas of what the significance of what their work and their technique and all these things were. Schoenberg is a good example, right? Like the 12 tone technique both seems to have this like insane potent necessity to it, and also just like a random like weird kind of idea that could easily have been discovered and thrown out by someone else. And as a matter of fact, it was. People will say Schoenberg didn't invent the 12 tone technique. It was Josef Matthias Hauer, this other random composer that no one's ever heard of. So yeah, I think that it's not necessarily that if somebody has these, postmodern attitudes that they can't make good art, nor is it necessarily the case that somebody who's read a lot of Adorno or Clement Greenberg is going to make good art. I think we have examples, counterexamples for both of those. Um, but yeah, those are things to keep.
So I also wanted to bring up, since we're both sort of the Zoomer generation,
Right.
and it's been increasingly of interest to Platypus, which is an organization that, at points in its history, talks a lot to the millennial left, to talk to and engage the Zoomers and understand the Zoomer generation more. I figured we could talk about what is Zoomer consciousness and how does it play out in Zoomer music.
Mm.
because I mean, I think I'm one of the more zoomery zoomers I know, and I listen to I listen to some very zoomery music. I'm thinking off the top of my head like Penelope Scott, Lil Darky, Hobo Johnson. 100
Mm,
Gex is probably the archetypal
right.
example that I would reach for. Would be
Right.
100 Gex.
That's what like Pitchfork or somebody would say is like peak Gen Z music, or like Too Slimy. I've heard people referring to Too
Oh, I don't even know
Slimy
Too
as,
Slimy.
yeah, he's like a rapper, you know. So,
Or Yeet, maybe. Is Yeet Zoomer
Yeet
music?
is pretty Zoomer, I feel, yeah. But then, so when you say like Zoomer consciousness, I guess the
Mm.
question is like, do we mean like a Zoomer aesthetic consciousness and the sort of corollary
Mm.
consciousness of history? Or do we mean like Zoomer psychology? Because I think there's reason to distinguish between the two. But also, in Platypus, for example, we're I'm in the process with some other people of putting together, like Henry's helping me out with this, or Henry rather, I'm helping Henry out with this. This is Henry's idea, um, based on some conversations we had to do a Zoomer left panel. What is the Zoomer left?
Yeah.
And get Zoomer leftists of various different tendencies to just reflect on that question of like, is the Zoomer left a thing at all? Does it have to be? What defines it, even in its various forms? What are the similarities? What is the historical moment they're responding to, and how conscious of it are they, and how much does that matter? You know, can there be a productive forgetting of something as recent as like the the Bernie campaign?
Mm.
I don't know. I'm inclined to say no to that.
Definitely wouldn't suggest forgetting it.
Mm, right. I mean it. Well, it has been it's. I would maybe say the opposite, which is maybe it has been forgotten, but not in a productive way. Like
Mm.
yeah, like Zoomers, I feel like are so happy to be like, or the Zoomer left is happy to be like, well, Bernie was like a shill, and the evidence for that is not anything to do with Marxism, but just to say like, look how only recently did he change his tune on Israel and Palestine, right?
Mm.
So this unipolar, not unipolar, but a what's the yeah, just like tunnel vision on the issue of the day. And of course, the thing about Israel and Palestine is it's not the issue of just the day, right? It's this thing that's been going on for a very long time, for decades and decades. And so, why is the left suddenly having renewed interest in it? We should be like suspect of that. Like it's
Mm.
not that we have to be anti third worldist in the sense of like the West is the best or
Mm.
something, but we should also acknowledge that like the West as the sort of this central essential uh, part of global capitalism. The U.S. is where, even though there are ICE raids and things like that, there are still millions and millions of immigrants who come here to work and send money back home to their families in various countries of the world, right? And so, like, and then you also have, just there's a lot of different things with it, but the necessity for if there's not a necessity for socialism in the United States, then maybe there's not a necessity for socialism anywhere, right? If there's not a necessity for socialism in the most kind of like modern, urbane, you know, country on earth, then where would it apply, right? And so what seems like the radicalness of the Zoomers, that they're like super into China or whatever, is really a pessimism. As much as we might say like, oh, the millennial left was so naive, and maybe really secretly all along they never wanted to reconsider Marx, and they, through the lens of like Moise Pistone and a reconsideration of Lenin and Kautsky and all these things.
Mm.
But it was really always, this would be the pessimistic thing, which I think we can't say, which would just be to say all along it was all just going to lead into the Bernie campaign anyways. And I don't think, we can or should say that, right? It was like a real moment of failure, not just like a tragic, inevitable death.
Mm.
Um, and but what we have left now is like people being like, well, China and the CCP are like great and awesome, and it's like you don't get to make fun of social democrats if you're like thinking that China is going to take us to socialism in 50 years.
Mm.
At that point you actually don't get to make fun of Bernie anymore. In terms of like uh, the pessimism of the millennial left liquidating itself into the Bernie campaign is only a fraction of the pessimism that you need to then say, oh, well, nothing that fucking happens in America even matters anyway, because China is going to save the day.
Mm.
But if they don't, it's America's fault. It's just like, what is this? It's just like, as the kids would say, it's cope, it's copium.
Mm.
And I don't know if we need any more of that. Or if we have it, we should be conscious of it. So, we should, maybe consume our rap music like you consume whatever, a cigarette or whatever, but be conscious of it. I like the cigarette as a metaphor for certain things because it's not like weed or alcohol where you're kind of incapacitating yourself. It's like I'm taking myself out of reality for 30 seconds. I think
Mm.
that's interesting. And this sort of compartmentalization could be helpful to Gen Z, I think, rather than putting all their hopes and dreams onto like some political thing, which is like does have this false sense of immediacy when really it's just
Mm.
this weird garbled historical task that's been passed down in a kind of, I shouldn't say like in a telephone game sort of way, but if you think of what Black Lives Matter was to the civil rights movement, right, it was more pessimistic. It was much more pessimistic. And so, then you get this even more pessimistic form of this earlier historical project. And then that fails and people feel disillusioned. And then they have to, like, almost like a drug. It's like, what can I support that will make me feel more and more radical than the previous thing I supported?
Yeah.
And
The only thing they know is to double down on the value system that's failing them.
right. And I think we could all benefit from learning to, you know, uh, experience that need that we have as Zoomers for whatever the sort of narcissistic escape and retreat, and not immediately conflating it with our like politics. I think that would be very valuable to be able to, you know, yeah, to be able to watch a dumb movie or whatever without having to justify it as like something political or whatever, because
Yeah.
we have these personal desires which are going to go against everything about whatever movement we might want to support or whatever movement we might want to create. We have these personal desires to, act impishly or just to do stuff that isn't related, to just occasionally escape to your like Walden Pond cabin or whatever. And I think just the need for balance. I think Gen Z needs more balance and the ability to like, um, you know, organize their time and also their thoughts, and to not let everything sort of bleed into one another in
Mm.
this sort of way where it's like everything is dependent on this moment. And it's like actually the freeing thing that maybe will help Gen Z, that's helped me with like whatever, you know, extreme just like feelings of what would I call it? Um, just like the crushing feeling of like we're coming at the end of a historical train wreck, which is like seconds from whatever. It's
Mm.
like, well, actually, the moment of crisis right now is not even that severe. The fact is that 2026 is not going to be a year that goes in the history books in the way that 1776, 789, 1848, 1917. or even whatever, right? Like 1980, Reagan, like
I mean,
I don't know, maybe 2016, maybe Trump, but
that's
you
like
know,
the energy of all of Zoomer music too. Like all
is that
this
everything depends
music
on this
is
moment.
that
Yes.
like the unifying feature is sort of everything's on fire, right? Like
Hmm.
even the jokeriness of it, right? The chaotic nature of it is meant to artistically represent a feeling that's very real right now, that everything's on fire.
Yeah.
And so the fact that it's not on fire is maybe the biggest
Right.
taboo for the
Yeah.
Gen Z.
Yeah, good point. I mean, I'm at a point where I feel I can't be the only one who sort of cringes when I hear like an Instagram reel ad for a song that's like, the government is run by pedophiles.
Right.
Whatever. Like,
I had this
I kind of,
experience of hanging out with like a friend who maybe even like a few years ago,
yeah.
maybe this would have resonated with me differently. I don't know. But I was hanging out with this friend and he was like, "Oh man, I gotta show you this amazing, this sick song. You gotta hear this. You're gonna love this." And he plays this song and it's like just like standard metalcore, and he's just singing about like killing fascists, and
Yeah.
that's the song. And I'm like, okay, and you thought I would love that. Why? What was interesting about this that you've just showed me?
Right.
Um,
Well, I guess also like, maybe to touch on you, Dominic, have this sort of, I don't know how you would put it, but you kind of want to be like a critical Zoomer, right? Like you want to
mm,
acknowledge your Zoomerness and not just like reject it and throw it off. But you also want to not just celebrate it as necessarily a good thing, I think. And, one way that I think we've talked previously about an angle to consider for that is like, what is the significance of the sort of political compass
mm,
culture of online politics, of like teenagers who spend 6 months as an anarcho-capitalist and then they become like a Nazi and then they become like whatever, you know, libertarian communist, or,
mm,
or something even more obscure and esoteric than those three, whatever. And just like, does this mean that, I think me and Henry have talked about this. Does this mean that Gen Z is more open minded? Or does this mean that Gen Z is more gullible, right?
mm.
Or does this mean that Gen Z is more, open to thinking about things in new ways? Or does it mean that they're more desperate to like latch on to some kind of thought terminating cliches, whatever they are,
Right.
right? And I mean, I think it has the character of both in a certain way, and that, we're just in a moment where it's like, how would you even. I find it difficult to see how it would be valuable to think through it on anything more than a personal level. Just to be aware of it when you do it as a person, right? Because I do it as a person. I tend to think in these all or nothing terms that are just completely incongruous and not appropriate to the moment, right? Like you know, in 2020 with BLM or whatever, I remember I didn't go to any of the protests, but I was certainly an Instagram story warrior. Like I was like, whatever. And I had this idea in the back of my mind of like, okay, this is really like some of these things that these people who are supposed to be my like political allies are saying are really dumb, and
Mm,
to the point where they make me like, a little frightened. But whatever, this is just like rhetoric, right? Like this isn't real what they're saying. They don't actually think that,
mm,
you know. And then of course you have like the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone and stuff like that, which just was kind of this like extreme demonstration, maybe not of Gen Z's naivete, but of their kind of, yeah, well, a certain naivete of the Gen Z left. You could also see that the 2020 like George Floyd protests and Chaz as the sort of last gasp of a very pessimistic millennial left, right? And
mm,
so, to the extent that there's a Zoomer left, they got politicized by this, big temper tantrum of the waning millennial left, which was like,
Mm.
the George Floyd protest during the COVID lockdown, right? And just the the so we were born in politically in this moment of extreme uh, cognitive dissonance
Yeah, I
of like
mean,
anybody who goes outside
I think our role
is a
models
Nazi who
are.
wants everyone to die and get COVID, but also uh, this protest is the most important thing that's ever happened in like the history of our country or whatever.
I think our role models are crashing out, right? There's this the millennials went to do something, and then having maybe not succeeded, they're kind of upset about it, and the Zoomers are being raised by the upset about it version.
Mm,
Oh, but I wanted to return to, since you mentioned the political compass and how that's sort of an emphasis of mine. I do think there is a bit of a parallel where I've noticed in music, uh, it was Neopunk FM was the YouTuber that made me think this. They were doing some kind of a video essay about music, and this is my term I've come up with, but it was like wanna be weird or wanna be different music, and they're trying to talk
yeah,
about like the rate my music, the Radiohead, where it's not corporate pop music, it's not on the radio, it's not mainstream, but in another sense it kind of must be mainstream for it to be number one for all these art nerd, like
sure.
artsy type music listeners to all converge on Radiohead.
Mm,
There must be something kind of mainstream to it, and they were sort of criticizing the idea that there's a kind of a clout in some of these communities of being like, oh, I listen to the weirdest, most esoteric shit possible.
mm,
um, and I felt the same feeling, the same twinge that I feel when there's the criticism of the political compass, the twinge of like, this is a thing that is being, it's kind of getting killed in the womb, like before it's even become a thing.
mm,
Like these people who have just begun to move out of the mainstream and into weirdness are already being shot back to the mainstream.
mm,
And it's the same sort of, I feel the same sort of a sense with the political compass and with Zoomer culture in general, that immediately upon its birth, it was ready, people were ready to criticize its immaturity and its unseriousness. But in some ways, I think there's a value to an unseriousness in politics right now. It's like you were saying earlier about maybe developing a self awareness of when maybe what you're doing doesn't need to be related to politics. I had a
mm,
friend on, and he's very apolitical, and I had him on as for an interview here. And one of the things that I felt I learned from talking to him at length is just how much of a taboo there is today on being consciously apolitical. Like he
oh
feels very
yeah,
alienated
oh
from
yeah,
the world right now because he doesn't want to talk about politics. He feels very pressured into
right.
talking about
Well,
politics.
I will say one thing that has been a nice respite from that is getting a job.
Oh yeah.
Because in a job environment, you depends, of course, but oftentimes you are the thing that we might have like bemoaned a while ago of being forced to sort of conceal your political views.
Mm.
You now it feels nice,
Right.
right?
Like, oh my God, I'm so glad I'm in a place where I don't have to
Uh,
have political views for once.
yeah,
I can just come in and talk about like the game on Saturday.
yeah. Or like yeah, or like maybe somebody does make
Mhm.
a snide comment about this or that thing that they know they can get away with, or
Right.
like implying something, but it's like I already know the script. I don't care. I'm just here to do my job. So in conclusion, I guess, so that we can wrap up our video here, I think we need to. Uh, Gen Z suffers from a lot of psychological problems. And I think that this is not, of course, unique to Gen Z, but there's something about these, psychological problems that I don't feel necessarily qualified to speak about. Christopher Lasch, The Culture of Narcissism, and right, like how accurate is that, as like a descriptive account of, maybe the world that we increasingly live in socially. I don't
Mm-hmm.
know. Um, but I think what is clear is that Gen Z needs to. Mm, Gen Z would be happier if it realized how insignificant it was, and that it was not like
Yeah.
uh, beholden to this mythology of like Gen Z. Because here's the word that people always use is radicalized, right? Gen Z was radicalized on the right and on the left, right?
Mm.
They were radicalized by these things. What radicalized you? And Gen Z is not that radical, and it doesn't really have the opportunity to be. I mean, what is it going to be radical about? You know, um, you can be like, well, of course, that leaves the door open for people to say, oh, well, have you considered this? And, I welcome that people would be trying to come up with ways to like revive the like meaningful character of history and not just history as like this dusty, obscure thing, or a historicism which loses sight of, the point of history and turns it into like, empirical data and cycles and like, oh, this thing happens in these historical conditions, therefore we can infer that this is where we're headed. Whether it takes up like, whether it's in a sophisticated form or if it's like, Eastern mysticism, like the Kali Yuga is coming, like Joe
Mm.
Rogan will say or whatever. I think that,
The
um,
age of
yeah,
Aquarius.
right, right. And those are, kind of underneath even like, that this kind of cyclical, you know, history can be interpreted based on, as like essentially data that we extrapolate from is a lower horizon, and I think that's what we need to maybe like rally against. But you also have people who are just so ignorant of the actual historical data that you might make, you know, extrapolations and claims out of. Like people really don't know um, the ways in which we are repeating, but in a more sort of debased and futile form, some of the things that the new left has done. And
Mm.
oftentimes they repeat these things in the name of a rebellion against the new left and against, whatever, postmodernism,
Right.
Frankfurt School, which get lumped together even though they're, quite different.
Mm.
Um, uh,
Regression
yeah,
in one word.
right, right. I mean, there's a regression in our historical consciousness, and for like a reason that kind of makes sense, because what does it matter if you know about, Adam Smith and Hegel and Rousseau and, you know, Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, and Adorno, and you can like construct, how are they related and what is this grand task that they were all conscious of that was advancing, you know. Right now, it really doesn't pay to think about those things. And so, you can, I don't know. I mean, I'll say this, right? Like, I don't blame Platypus, but I blame the Gen Z way that my psychology tried to rationalize Platypus as like a meaning of life. And it's like, no, you have to have a connection to the world outside of Platypus. Or if you're not a Platypus member, but you're in like, whatever your organization is, you should have like a life outside of that.
Yeah, I mean,
Um,
obviously, the real task of history, the real meaning of life, is the building of the machine god at the end of
right.
time.
Yeah, we're so prone to forgetting the importance of the building Rocco's basilisk,
Yeah, yeah.
or But in all seriousness, I think that Gen Z. I don't want to be like making Nostradamucal predictions and shit, but I think Gen Z will age poorly,
Mm.
both physically because we're all vaping and smoking cigarettes, and doing Xanax and whatever.
Not me, baby. I'm straight edge.
I think that's great. I do think that's great, honestly. I respect it a lot. Um, but also I think is Gen Z, gonna have are they gonna be able to make sense of their lives as they grow older, or will they have to, I just don't know. I just don't know. Like, I think we're just gonna get hit with a bunch of random stuff for a little bit, and it's
Mm.
not really gonna, you know, because if there was an immediate and obvious, even if it took a little bit of thinking to become obvious, if there was an immediate like sort of chink in the armor where it's like, okay, here is where we should start to try to overcome capitalism. And
Mm.
it's going to be a slog, but we know for a fact that this is like approximately what we have to do. If that was the case, then I think, you know, there wouldn't be a necessity for something like uh, platypus, right? I think the point of
Mm.
platypus is not merely to say, oh, there's this, simple thing we just have to do, which is rebuild the Second International or something, and all the leftists are ignoring it and avoiding the task for various reasons. No, the point is also to say, well, no, we're not just trying to be McNairites. We're not just trying to be like um, uh, reviving the Second International in an era where workers' organizations have been crippled, and then take it as like, because that's also like not adequate to the task of the moment to try to just rebuild the Second International without recognizing that the Second International didn't have to actually create any parties, right? Or any,
Mm.
they didn't have to say, let's create this or that union or whatever, right? And so if we live in this sort of barren desert landscape of the left where we have to do stuff like that, um, then like fantasizing that we're literally Trotsky or something, or literally Luxembourg, or literally Kautsky or whoever, or Lenin would be the obvious one, is not really going to be super helpful. And, I would just echo something that Chris Catrone has said many times before of like, this Marxism stuff is, if it's going to be useful, it's going to be useful at a later stage,
Mm.
right? Like, otherwise, we're inclined to try to reduce Marxism to the level of the weird, petty, immediate things going on and say, like, well, Marxism is why you have to be pro Palestine or be, marching in the streets with Black Lives Matter or whatever. Even if these things are correct, right? Like, even if, you can do out the math and be like, well, you should be pro Palestine. You should be, I did the moral calculations.
Mm.
Um, Marxism just isn't about that. It's, it's amoral in a real sense. And yeah, I feel like I've gone on way too long for
No,
what was supposed to be my brief conclusion, but
that's okay. I think you've done the full circle back to the pre-political nature of platypus. Because if I were to give
yeah.
a summary, I would say the platypus's main insight is this: the death of the left, the pre-political character of the present moment. That we're
Mm-hmm.
not even at a place where Marxism is yet immediately relevant.
Right. And you only condemn yourself to further irrelevance if you try to hop over it and say, like, well, we just need a more authentic interpretation of Lenin, right? Because
Mm.
even Platypus is not necessarily trying to say, like, I mean, on a certain level, we accept that we're a part of the sectarian left. But the point is not to say, oh, if you just read this obscure writing of Lenin, then it
Mm.
would all make sense, and they've been repressing this one. Like, no, the Platypus syllabus is supposed to be, these are the texts that the left reads and talks about, or at least used to read and talk about, because
Right.
maybe Gen Z is gonna, maybe for Gen Z it's gonna be like, whatever. It's going to be, I don't even want to hazard a guess. It's Michael
Dugan,
Parenti.
Land,
Yeah.
Kaczynski.
Yeah. Or Michael Parenti, like, the like
Right.
neo-Stalinism.
No, Parenti's popular too.
Yeah. I mean, I read Parenti at a certain point because I was trying to figure out what Marxism was, and somebody was like, well, the best explanation of what Marxism is Black Shirts and Reds by Michael Parenti. So I read it, and I found the rhetorical style exciting, but I also felt that there was something kind of weird, like, left unspoken. Like, it makes a sort of, there's a lot of missing links between some of the things that he wants to roll together into like his apologia for communism in the 20th century, really. And yeah, I don't know. I can see why Gen Z is brought to it because, Michael Parenti, you read Michael Parenti, and if you kind of let yourself flow with it and you haven't really thought too deeply about some of this stuff, but you sense its importance and you kind of want to connect the dots, you can easily be like hypnotized into this sense that the most important task for the present is to defend the honor of the Soviet Union, right? Like so much of the left believes this, or like of China, right? And to like communist China, the Sino-Soviet split, I guess, never happened, right? Or like whatever, these sorts of things. Maoists understood that the Sino-Soviet split was happening when it happened, but the people who are taking this stuff up today are like, well, I'm just a Marxist Leninist, by which they mean not to like not to really overcome, but merely to flatten those like 20th century issues of like, well, being a Maoist and being a Marxist Leninist actually meant a different thing at a certain point. But now it's like, well, Marxism, Leninism can absorb. This is how Gen Z treats it, I feel.
Yeah.
Is that Gen Z is less Gen Z is less prone to actually saying, oh, I'm a Maoist or I'm a Hojaist or whatever. I'm a Gonzaloite or whatever, these super particular things. They're much more inclined to try to do this apologia for all of 20th century communism and socialism in the form of, basically obfuscating the rifts within that, because that's the whole point is like, the, well, I don't know, just there's so much confusion, and it's important to maybe keep a level head, and your passion is what inspires you to learn about this stuff, but you have to also not kill your passion and view these things in like a objective way or whatever, but to question your passion. And when like I've talked to people in Platypus about like, yeah, sometimes you can sort of have a moment where you're watching a Platypus panel where somebody you wouldn't agree with says something you wouldn't agree with, and you're actually very inspired by it, and you feel kind of like you feel it, and so you should allow yourself to feel those things, but also question those feelings and not take them as evidence that you're correct. I mean, this is something that I've seen recently, I think, developing on, somebody was saying on Discord, right? There's some group of like Marxists associated maybe with I won't hazard a guess to say which party because I don't remember, and I'll just say the wrong one. But there's people who are trying to come up with like a Marxist normative ethics, or like a Marxist ethical theory, right? Ethical being like sub-moral in a way. Ethical makes me think of like Aristotle and right, like the ancient world, and this idea that Marxism can somehow be deduced from like people's intuitive, correct moral judgments of like oppression is bad, and these, and that's just the thing that we keep tripping over. Like the right also thinks oppression is bad. And you might say, oh, but the right has a garbled sense of who's oppressed, and they think that these groups are oppressed when actually no, these are the groups doing the oppression or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, but the left has that too, right? Like the left has blind spots for, oppression that doesn't fit into their model of the world. And also
Yeah,
the
the left
yeah,
is not empathy.
the left is not
The
empathy,
left is not just
right?
like the combined empathy side of humanity,
Right.
and I see that so often. The juxtaposition of the two extremes. You see that meme all the time. Well, the right wing extremists want to kill all minorities. The left wing extremists want empathy and healthcare.
Right.
And like, I'm not sure it's
Yeah.
that simple actually.
Yeah, it's like, why even think about things if that's the thoughts you're going to think? Like, it just doesn't, if everything's prepackaged and everything you hear from the right just goes, everything you hear from a leftist, even if it's stupid, you're like, oh, I know that they were trying to say this. And everything you hear from the
Mm,
right is just, well, that's bad. And even if it sort of makes sense, it's a dog whistle, you know. And
mm,
it's like, well, why even bother thinking or talking or listening or speaking if that's the way we're going to go? I think it's really unfortunate. But also, of course, it makes sense that people want to. I mean, it seems like the world is full of a lot of like evil. I think Gen Z likes
mm,
this idea of like evil and that there might even be like demons and that maybe Peter Thiel isn't just, some guy who has a
mm,
weird obsession with the Antichrist, but maybe he really is the Antichrist. Like
right.
Gen Z will flirt with this, older generations too, but notably with Gen Z because this is their adolescence as they're becoming people,
Mm,
as they're becoming the leftists or rightists or whatever that they're going to become. And I just think we have to caution against this sort of moralistic stuff. It makes sense because the world is so messed up that you might want to try to like point a finger, but actually pointing a finger might be a way of avoiding cleaning up the problem, right?
mm. And I think one of my goals on the channel is also to emphasize division in a way, because I think
Mm,
people's instinct, especially in a conversation, just on a basic level, is like, oh, we actually all agree ultimately. Like deep down, we can all come together and we actually
right.
all get along. Secret, like we have things in common. Let's reach for those things in common, and we end up flattening things too. And the vilification flattens things as well. Like I wanted to make a conversation about distinctions between different types of like trans critical perspectives, like gender criticals versus Blair White, like
Mm,
different groups, because there's a flattening of those groups, and I want to bring out those distinctions. And that's one of the things that the political compass kind of does nicely, or that this increasingly niche zoomery thing does nicely, is that it brings out those divisions. If somebody is a
mm,
post neo and narco monarchist, clearly they have a very specific view, and
right.
they're willing to
Sure.
identify themselves as very specific and as characterized by something more heightenedly specific than some of these false unities.
Mm. Yeah, I mean that's definitely true. Just to you know pull up the other end as well. I think that we should be wary of that specificity when it seems to be just like this arbitrary sort of thing. You see in many cases how people's politics are very clearly personal,
Mm,
nationalistic on the basis of family or things like that. It's okay. It's to be expected. But at a certain point, I think like the things that have gotten flattened out, right? To sort of unflatten them, you have to kind of see the way in which they are now flat and
mm,
acknowledge, right? Like what are people trying to do with this new flattened concept they've created of like, for example, the new left, like the Frankfurt School and postmodernism and the new left all become this like one thing,
mm,
right? For the right, it was all thing, including kind of like Maoism and stuff. And now for the left, it's like, well, the Maoism is separate from that, right?
right.
And if you're coming at it from like a platypus perspective, then you might, there's almost no end to the distinctions that you might want to make, because the you know this the history of like the 20th century is just much more ambiguous than the history prior, even though the history prior has a kind of newfound ambiguity now, where it's like, what do you even do with this stuff? It seems so far removed. But like specifically, you know, the 19th century feels farther than the 18th century, I think, is something that Chris also said, which I thought was kind of interesting and true. Like we can kind of imagine romantic pre-capitalism, and that's kind of what the 18th century is, right? It's pre-capitalism. It's like peak bourgeois society,
Mm.
before capitalism as a contradiction within bourgeois society, and we can imagine that better than we can imagine the 19th century, even though that's like the moment that we continue to live in, is that contradictory moment. So, the point of unflattening out any of these flattened things would be to acknowledge the moment of possibility that was lost, and that there are moments of possibility even in the millennial left. I think is worth considering. You know, certainly not something that we would just assert like we could scientifically prove it, but in a critical way, it's like, no, we don't want to flatten out the highest aspirations of the millennial left and just say, well, they were always doomed to fail, and maybe they weren't really honest, or maybe they were obfuscatory, right? All this talk about Marxist theory mumbo jumbo was really just a way to whatever, and you have to. It wasn't. There was a real possibility, not in the sense of like, oh, you can prove that in another timeline something would have come of it for the better, but think, in the critical sense, there was a possibility that we would be it would behoove us to acknowledge, if we want to have another moment of possibility in the future and be able to
Mm.
recognize it.
I've been watching a lot of Jordan Peterson lately, and I think we'll close out after this. But I've
Yeah.
been watching a lot of Jordan Peterson lately, and one thing that strikes me as a kind of a similarity is the emphasis on responsibility. There is a sense in which the left hasn't taken responsibility
Mm,
for this history,
right.
and by, like you're saying, if you just completely wash away the millennial left without acknowledging there was even a moment of possibility, then it kind of does away with responsibility for millennials too. Like,
Right.
oh, there wasn't even really a moment for you guys to try to do something real.
Right. Like there was no chance.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, it's just it's tricky to think about, but the way that people's morals get get uh, bound up in their politics on the left and on the right
Mm.
too, right? Because what we interpret as like the evil of like the transhumanist Elon Musk, Peter Thiel, AI, whatever, um, is in fact like it has its own sort of moral presuppositions of like, maybe not exactly like consequentialism or whatever, but this idea of like, well, humanity should perfect itself and it shouldn't be imperfect if it can help
No,
it.
that's an
And
ethical statement.
right, and it's one that I like kind of agree with. I just kind of disagree with the methods in a certain way, and not even as badly as the left does, hysterically being like AI. I don't know. I guess I want to close out this video by making a provocative statement about AI,
Okay, go
which
for
is that
it.
you know uh, anti-AI stuff is being used in a retroactive way to justify all non-AI art as like artisanal labor that must be respected, right?
Mm.
And so this is why I think people use it ironically and sarcastically, and it's not real. But if you've seen the picture of Peter Griffin snapping a pencil in half and he says AI is better than pencil slop or something like that. And I just think that like
No, I
The
would
problems with
agree with
AI are also the problems with regular art, like regular
yeah. I mean,
non-AI art and
it's
music.
reification.
Right. I mean, that's where it learned this shit from. You
Exactly.
know, or
It's
like yeah.
I say I'm less afraid of the AIs and I'm more afraid of the people whose opinions are indistinguishable from an AI
Right.
generating their opinions for
Right.
them.
It's like why does ChatGPT use like M dashes and it says like not blank, just blank, or whatever. It's because there are people who really write like this, and ChatGPT was trained off of that data, you know. And so it's like blame the humans. Don't blame poor AI, which is just trying to make you happy, and then you're like, no, you use so much water. I also think maybe we have to say something about how the water cycle works.
Yeah.
But that's maybe we'll get on that next time.
Yeah. Is there anything you want to plug before we close out? Any do you have a feed?
Yeah. Well, I've been thinking about making a blog recently, but I haven't done it yet, or like a Substack. I feel like maybe I'll get like, I'll get some bonus points in like heaven for not having made a Substack. So I'm kind of holding out. But I do music, and my music is not necessarily cutting edge, avant-garde, whatever. But it has these influences, and I try to continually, push it farther. Although it still has an experimental quality, which I'm not satisfied with. So, 51st Citizen. You can look up my musical project, 51st Citizen, and you can listen to the stuff and see what you think. And really, that's about it that I have to plug. I guess the other thing would be people can read my interview with Matei Alexandru in the Platypus Review from last year, or maybe 2 years ago. From last year it was published, but it was a live interview done in 2024. And maybe that can give people a sense of like how I'm thinking about my relationship to the existing Zoomer left, as Matei is a part of that. So those would be the two jumping off points. And also I would just say like, no, that's it.
All right. On that note,
Yeah.
it was nice to have you.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely.
Yeah, this was good stuff.